I grew up in an extended family, my mother's family, that knew how to laugh. Sometimes just polite snickers, sometimes a sly grin, and occasional belly laughing, the kind that some people say is equivalent to the health benefits of jogging. And I'd like to believe that's true. Our family could have written the book on self-deprecating stories. And as some of our friends have said, we have a lot to be humble about. One uncle went downtown one day to pick up the mail in the post office. He was a little absent-minded. He climbed into the back seat of the car when he returned. Suddenly realized there was no steering wheel. And there definitely was no chauffeur for the preacher in a town of 1,500 people. A bunch of people might have seen him, but had he not told us the story, we would never have known. He probably even told the story on himself in a sermon the next Sunday. My dad and his brother married sisters, not their own sisters, but sisters in the Miller family. And my double first cousins and I have enjoyed telling stories from our childhood that we remember. One of them was when our four parents boarded an early morning flight in Cedar Rapids for a very rare business trip to the Bahamas. The flight attendant was serving tomato juice, which Dad and Uncle Morris noticed actually was a Bloody Mary mix. But they weren't about to stop the show. One of them took a big gulp, and Dad said her head covering practically vibrated. The other sister took just a very small sip and then politely informed the flight attendant that the tomato juice was spoiled. Three of the families were in business together for more than 40 years. We went to the same church 3 times a week, where my uncle was a pastor, and with double first cousins, we couldn't get away from each other. Business all week, church on the weekends, and on Wednesday evening, and every family gathering. And we got along, at least so far as I can recall. Most likely, I think, it was the humor that oiled the relationships. And I'm forever grateful that starting with my grandparents, who I didn't really know all that well, I was 8 years old and then 12 when they passed, but I do know from stories of their past that they had a great sense of humor, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also equally grateful that they modeled how to cry, especially the men. I learned very early in life that some of my friends were not given that freedom. One Sunday afternoon, I was riding bareback with my buddy on a pony. He slapped the horse, and I somersaulted backward off the horse onto the macadam street, landed on my wrist. I was about 10 years old, as I recall. It hurt, and I cried. And my buddy made fun of me for crying. Boys don't cry. Honestly, I was so mad at him that I wanted to make him cry. His insult seemed strange to me because I saw my dad and my uncles cry, and I knew that they were real men. I've cried a lot in the last several years. I've cried several times this week. For a number of reasons, sometimes more predictable than others. I woke up one morning crying. My mind was swirling with a mishmash of contradictory thoughts, even in my dreams. Any thinking person knew going into the presidential election that no outcome would heal the sharp divisions in our communities, churches, and nation. There was a survey just prior to the election that indicated that more than 70% of Americans thought the country was headed in the wrong direction. And I looked at that statistic and I said, that's totally meaningless. because I honestly believe that people on both ends of the political spectrum might have said yes, but for diametrically different reasons. There are plenty of reasons to cry. In our elders meeting on Tuesday, Donna Schenk, in her role, and thank you for the children's story this morning, in her role as the elder for Incarnational Witness, shared from a meeting that she attended just that morning on Tuesday, hosted by Church World Service. We have children in this community who are afraid their parents won't be at home when they return from school. Teachers and school leaders are having to provide safe space for little children who wonder what the future holds. And if that doesn't make one cry, I suggest one's empathy genes ought to be tested. Employers are wondering how the promised deportations might negatively impact their organizations, including some that we are very familiar with. And those reasons may be largely external to most of us, although some of us deal with that on a daily basis, but those may be somewhat external. They are real for the families involved, but there are other reasons to cry. We, among us, challenging health concerns, inevitable stresses of aging, seemingly intractable relational problems, loss of loved ones. Tears flow easily or lie just beneath the surface, sometimes triggered unexpectedly. And it's understandable that personal and family crises can overwhelm our senses and diminish our capacity to care about the larger world. And therein lies our privilege, to care deeply for each other, and as we can, to care for the larger world in deep distress. We have the gifts among us. Our task is to find ways to bless and release them. The words of Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann, written just days ago, I think are worth imprinting on our hearts and minds. It's all right to engage in self-care, to be on the receiving end of gracious presence, but there is a limit to the length of time we are to linger in self-regard. We are, sooner or later, dispatched back to the good work of humane justice. The text that was read a few moments ago from Mark 13 follows immediately from the text that we looked at last Sunday, and thanks to Ethan Zook for what I thought was a very instructive children's story last Sunday, and to Caleb Schrock-Hurst for his excellent message on the widow's mite. And remember that scene. Jesus was just leaving the temple where he had watched the wealthy and the poor put money into the treasury. And we don't know for certain, but if you read the text from Mark 12 through 13, the flow of the text suggests that immediately after having blessed the widow for her generosity, Jesus immediately sees and hears the disciples excitedly talking about the magnificent buildings. You have to ask the question, were they totally tone deaf? Had they even heard what he had just said? Jesus had just highlighted the extraordinary generosity of the poor widow, and the disciples were impressed by the massive stones of the temple. And then Jesus, as was his teaching style, threw them a curve. Not one stone will be left on another, everyone will be thrown down. The disciples were organizing for a great celebration around a magnificent temple, and Jesus says, these stones are going to fall down. And the entire chapter 13 is a long recitation of bad news. Earthquakes, famines, arrests, children rebelling against parents, desolation, false prophets, sun won't shine, stars falling from the sky. It's enough to make grown men and women cry. The bad news is that to be human is to suffer and to cry. As the late psychiatrist Dr. M. Scott Peck opened his book, The Road Less Traveled, life is difficult. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths, he says. It's a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult, because once it is accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters. Life is difficult. The bad news is that no matter how much we wish it was otherwise, the future is unknown. I hope I'm wrong. But I have little doubt that some things may get worse before they get better. And the bad news ain't going away anytime soon. I also believe and fervently hope that the worst possibilities will not materialize, but in reality, none of us knows. So what does that mean for our daily lives and for our congregational life together? Here's the good news. The good news is that our spiritual ancestors from Jesus himself, the disciples, the early church, and our Anabaptist fathers and mothers have left a witness for us to emulate. Jesus faced opposition from the Roman Empire. The early church struggled with Constantine, who wanted to bend the church to his political whims. And here we are, ironically, approaching the 500th anniversary of the first Anabaptist adult baptisms on January 21, 1525. Conrad Grebel baptized George Blaurock, and then he baptized several others. And what we might think is just kind of a normal thing for us in our day and age, that was a radical move, a radical action in its time and place. And we know from the Martyr's Mirror and many other sources that the years following were extremely difficult. So this is our opportunity to recommit ourselves as followers of Jesus, to walk straight into the conflicts that divide us, to be clear-eyed about the failures of the church over the centuries, to stay true to our mission. As one friend put it on Facebook a few days ago, one lesson that we Christians have not learned in the past 2,000 plus years is that Jesus had no political control over the Roman Empire, and he still changed the entire world. We keep trying to change the world the way the Roman Empire did instead of the way Jesus did. As Caleb reminded us last Sunday, the theologian Karl Barth called us to approach life with the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other. It's not a call to retreat from the empire or to remove ourselves from the realities we face. Jesus was offered political power and chose another path, but he did speak as a prophet to those in power. So how do we counter this strong pull to dwell on the bad news of our lives? 3 suggestions. 1, recommit ourselves to the Anabaptist perspective as followers of Jesus. The history of the Christian church has shown that a reformation occurs every few generations, and the timing seems right for another one. To claim a particular faith tradition is not to say we have a corner on the truth. For years, I have argued that every Christian has a theological faith tradition, and I don't buy the notion the non-denominationalism is somehow more biblical. In many cases, it is a faith tradition, maybe not named. As Anabaptists, we hold to several primary principles. We interpret the Old Testament through the eyes of Jesus because we take our cues from the way Jesus interpreted the Old Testament. We believe in the primacy of the Sermon on the Mount, and we reject dispensationalism, or to put it more positive, we believe Jesus said what he meant what he said, and we believe he was talking to us, not to some future time. So our calling, I think, is to encourage each other and to invite others to bring about the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. We sing that vision every single Sunday morning. A word of caution. There's a movement with a local presence. If that's God calling, There's a movement with a local presence that calls itself the Apostolic Reformation. There's an article about that in the DNR this week. It's directly tied to Christian nationalism movement, which is the polar opposite of the Anabaptist Reformation of 500 years ago. It would be unthinkable to our spiritual ancestors who opposed the state church 5 centuries ago to support the vision of this apostolic reformation. Second word of warning. There's a movie in the local theaters. Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Spy, Assassin. I've not yet seen it. Be aware that it has direct ties to Eric Metaxas, who is totally committed to the Christian nationalist movement. And most Bonhoeffer's scholars, including Mark Thiessen Nation of Eastern Mennonite Seminary, past professor of this community, believe that Metaxas has completely misinterpreted Bonhoeffer. But I do want to watch the movie because I want to know what has been said. Secondly, recommit ourselves to honoring the dignity of all people as created in the image of God. One of the most divisive and polarizing issues we face is that of national borders. Neither political party has been able to solve that issue, and it continues to be a very real problem, and I do not have the answers to that vexing problem. I don't profess to have the answers. But what I do profess to know is that every single human being, regardless of national origin, color of skin, or native language, carries the imprint of the image of God and deserves to be treated with dignity. And it's highly likely that this will be tested in our local community in the months ahead. And the question that each of us must face is, how would Jesus respond, and what is the church called to be and do? It's no longer just a theoretical or theological question. It has very practical dimensions. And thirdly, the third way of internalizing the good news as an antidote to the flood of bad news is the arts and music. Several days ago, Sarah Wenger-Shank, who has agreed to preach here in January, posted a poem on Facebook by a Jewish poet. It celebrates the changing of the seasons in many parts of the world, such as ours, a reminder of the beauty of the creation that we've been given to steward, and also a reminder of God's unfailing faithfulness even in the stress of hard times. And her post on Facebook included a photo of their young grandsons frolicking in the yard, unsuccessfully trying to catch the dancing leaves, jumping into the piles that were raked together. It is, in my mind, a picture of how life should be for all children and for adults who love all children. Leaves don't fall, they descend. Longing for earth, they come winging. In their time, they'll come again, for leaves don't fall, they descend. On the branches, they will be again, green and fragrant, cradle swinging, for leaves don't fall, they descend. Longing for earth, they come winging. And for me, it's critically important and imperative that we keep singing together. It's a shared language that crosses language barriers. It has the capacity to touch the deepest parts of our souls, to bring healing and hope, and frequently tears. So I close with the words of a pop song that's been ringing in my head all week by Linda Randall. One day at a time, sweet Jesus. That's all I'm asking of you. Just give me the strength to do every day what I have to do. Yesterday's gone, sweet Jesus, and tomorrow may never be mine. One day at a time, sweet Jesus. That's all I'm asking of you. Just give me the strength to do every day what I have to do. Yesterday's gone, sweet Jesus, and tomorrow may never be mine. Lord, help me today. Show me the way. One day at a time. Lord, help me today. Show me the way. One day at a time.